Let me start off with this. We had Dr. Donner ask that question. Dr. Donner says, what does it take to prove a negative response in humans? You heard what she said on that point. What do you say?
Generally speaking, what does it take to... The weights,
little closer.
The weight of the scales are not equal. It's much easier, as we all know in science, to prove a positive than it is to prove a negative, because through, what is it? Is it I need the philosopher, Tom Sorohan. It's metempiric. We only test within a limit range of exposures and circumstances, but someone could always say, well, you haven't tested it in these particular circumstances, you don't know what's going to happen there. So it's quite difficult. People have got to take a kind of balanced view about what constitutes human exposure or likely human exposure. So therefore, you have to sort of exercise your judgment and say, if you trust the epidemiology, and the epidemiology, and I say this with some hesitation as a toxicologist, that the epidemiology has done its very best over a range of human exposure, and you heard Bob McCanney say for carbon black, and probably the same goes for TiO2, that occupational scenarios are probably the highest exposure you're going to see in humans, and you've done as best you can with those studies. You've eliminated as far as you can biases, confounders, and chance, and you're still left with a reasonably good negative. Then you have to take a balanced view. You've gone as far as you can in showing that that particular substance is not causing a human risk if you've defined the endpoints. And I think you have to go with that. The animal evidence might be interesting. It might be scientifically relevant in some kind of way to explain or not explain. But animal studies can produce artifactual results which look like brilliant science, but they're maybe not relevant to humans. So I think you have to, in the end, go with good human data if it's there. If you don't have the good human data and you're relying on animal evidence alone, that's a different story, but somebody else can deal with that.
Dr. Weierhout, prove a negative response, highly relevant. It's sort of been in the back of our minds throughout these 2 days.
Well, from my perspective, that was pretty elegant, Len. But the other issue is, at least with the inhalation studies, again, you only see these effects in one species. And actually, I think they're developing some good reasons why the rat is even different from other rodent species and different from particularly the primates and the humans in terms of particle distribution, the types of tumors. Meinhold Schultz just left, but I think gave us a very instructive lecture on the differences on where particles deposit in being a human pathologist, how the tumors are very different than what we're calling tumors in rats, and distribution, the issue of the interstitium versus the alveolar ducts. So if you could see it in other species other than the rat, but it's uniquely found, at least these tumors, only in rats. And I'd like to hear what Gunther has to say.
Well, not much more, but to prove definitely a negative thing would be extremely difficult. But based on the strength of the evidence that we have with respect to the negative epidemiology, with respect to what we understand about mechanisms in animals, and being a secondary genotoxic mechanism at work here to cause the rat lung tumors, and also hearing from Dr. Schultz, he's not here at the moment, that the secondary inflammatory responses that we see in rats, he has not seen, and they are not seen in humans. So put all these together, and of course there's more mechanistic evidence, I think that should be strong enough to persuade people to accept that the rat-induced lung tumors cannot be easily extrapolated to humans.
Okay, yes, Professor Kirkland.
With all due respect to Maria's question, I'm not sure that we should be trying to prove a negative. I think this comes, unfortunately, from the kind of language that campaign groups and journalists use, when there is an issue raised about some area of exposure to chemicals or something of that sort, because you get the question, is it safe? The journalist asks, is it safe? And that implies zero risk. And there is no such thing as zero risk. When you walk outside, you get in the taxi, you cross the road, you get in the train, you get on the plane, you go on your bicycle, you play sport. There is no such thing as zero risk. I think the problem here is education. We, as a scientific community, have not been good enough at communicating with the people who broadcast publicly that there is no such thing as zero risk, that what we have a duty to do is to establish negligible, minimal, acceptable risk. We need to exclude unacceptable risk, but there is no such thing as zero risk, and therefore we should not be trying to prove a negative. We should be trying to prove that normal exposures will lead to negligible, minimal, at least acceptable risk.
Anybody in the audience on that topic? Of course, language induced by journalists, by media, that also feeds into the whole discussion about the precautionary principle, right?
Yeah, but I will not touch the precautionary principle at this level, which is rather a principle for policy and politics. We say that at the time, and I agree fully on that. But discussing about the weight of evidence and the tables you have shown and how the people should do, I believe we are facing a problem nowadays, is that indeed, under the pressure of politics, the regulatory experts, not saying the scientific community, the regulatory experts have to deliver assessment on a timeline and with a timing and deadlines and budgets which are totally out of perspective of what we expect from them regarding the time they should devote to weight of evidence, balancing assessment, and listening to the scientific community. And I believe that's where we have a hiatus between the gaps between the scientific community and, I would like to say, the same scientific community when they operate on regulatory bodies.
And Professor Kirkland made it clear how important it is to communicate on these concepts, maybe also on the concepts of risk and hazard. Anybody on risk and hazard? Yes.
Oh, you sure? Okay. I'm sorry. I think quite slowly. Forgive me. I was thinking about what David said, and I think I disagree is too strong a word, but I would like to sort of clarify a little bit. I think you have to distinguish between where no sort of hazard exists. If you don't think there's a hazard, then there isn't a risk, whether it's minimal or not. Once you start on the slope of whether it's minimal or whatever, up a scale, you're accepting the fact something can happen, but it might be a small chance. So I see a communication problem there, but if you actually genuinely believe the evidence gives you some kind of certainty that there's no hazard, and certainty is a hard word to use, but the best you can do with the evidence you've got, then there isn't actually a risk, and it's not a question of it's minimal. But we're not allowed to use the word safe, because, as I said before, it's a merit-empiric term, a world we live in. We can't, because if things haven't been tested in every possible circumstance, there's always that possibility that we could be wrong. But however, if we think there is no hazard, then it's not really a question of trying to quantify a risk which isn't there in your mind. So once you start accepting beyond no risk, no hazard, and there might be some kind of minimal risk there, it's a contradiction for me. So if you're saying there is no hazard, then you don't have to explain risk, because there isn't one. But only you can't prove it. And this goes back to the original question. How do you prove a negative? Well, of course, the first thing you learn in science is you can't prove a negative. That's why people on the opposite side, if you like, in discussions, say prove that it's safe, because they know you can't. So you always look stupid in those kind of discussions. So you never let yourself get backed into a corner. by a journalist to say, you know, tell me it's absolutely safe, because you know you can't, because you're making a judgment that you cannot substantiate.
Professor Grein.
Yeah, I somehow agree, but I disagree. You know, Paracelsus has not said his original message is not the dose makes the poison. The original message is everything is a poison. Only the dose makes that it's not a poison. You know, and therefore, if you are very low, big discussion about glyphosate in beer. Sure. It is not a risk. It is there. And it is a hazard because it has, the glyphosate has certain toxicological consequences. The hazard is there, but it makes, the problem is the dose. And therefore, if the dose is so low that it doesn't make sense to assume that there is a risk, then one has to say that.
Okay. Dr. Donner, and then we go back to panel. Dr. Donner. Yes.
Yeah, I like to add, since I initiated this interesting discussion, that of course...
Absolutely.
In the context of my presentation, I didn't really take it this far. I was talking about how do you prove a negative when you have a negative result for a test in the framework of the test, and it is not accepted because you might have, for example, 10 in vitro gene tox tests with negative results and a few in vivo tests. You have one that has a positive, and this puts your negative test results in question. So it came from that point of view, and I do believe that this should be something that should be possible to prove, journalists or no, around.
Okay. Should be possible to prove, Professor Kirkland?
Well, just a quick comment. I mean, yes, I did understand where Maria was coming from. Within the well-defined test systems for which we have test guidelines, then if we fulfill the criteria of that guideline, if we go to a high enough concentration, if we have enough sampling times, we score enough cells, a negative result should be accepted as clearly negative. That applies much more easily for in vitro studies where you've got a closed system and a defined exposure than it does for in vivo. I think I know where you're going with this, Maria. That is that when you go in vivo, how much is considered sufficient exposure of the target tissue? Are you expected to try to expose the bone marrow to the concentrations that led to chromosomal damage in vitro? Are you supposed to try and pump so much compound into a mouse that you will reach a plasma concentration of 300, 400, 500 microgram per mil? It's ridiculous. It won't happen. So when is a negative in vivo result acceptable? What level of exposure do you have to reach? What route of administration do you have to use? What testing, what dosing regime? Is it a single dose? Is it multiple doses, etc.? Those seem to be being questioned more and more by the regulators in recent months, recent years than they were before. And I can understand why the questions are being asked, but what it's leading to is calls for repeat studies. So go away, your micronucleus test wasn't acceptable because you didn't show exposure of the bone marrow, you didn't get enough, your plasma concentration wasn't high enough, so please go away and do a site of contact comet assay. That's just using more animals. Is it correct to do that? But those are the sort of things that are happening. And I think behind Maria's question is we could really do with some robust expert discussions on what constitutes an acceptable in vivo assay to follow up on a potential hazard that's been identified in vitro. And that, I think, does need to happen, and this isn't the right forum in which to do it, but I think it's going to be necessary in the short term.
Okay. Anybody else on this topic? Yes. So I had a question.
I say, David, actually that's already been done in pharmaceuticals in the ICH guidelines. So it does state clearly what a negative in vivo assay is, and that 2 negative in vivos negate any in vitro data whatsoever.
Yes, And I think one of the problems is that for pharmaceuticals, you have very robust toxicokinetic data, tissue distribution data. You know where the compound's going, and you know which tissues are being exposed, so you know where to target. With an industrial chemical, with a food additive, or something of that sort, you don't have that detail of information. Therefore, it opens up the questions that, okay, you didn't show any effect in the bone marrow, you only got to a concentration of 10 microgram per mil. How do we know that this compound might not be genotoxic in the GI tract, or in the liver, or in the kidney, because you don't have the same kind of toxicokinetic and tissue distribution data that you do for a pharmaceutical? That's the problem.
Okay. Anybody else on this? Of course, at the very beginning of this panel, precautionary principle was waved away. Professor Sarahan, you made it very clear it has no place in science. It's something about public policy, but it's very much part of the discussion, isn't it, in society at large?
Yeah, well, I think what I would like to see, I mean, I'm all in favour of authorities having the ability to use a precautionary principle, but they must state that that is what they're doing. And I think as long as, so the science must be kept separate from that, and the precautionary principle is brought in but clearly stated that that is what is being done.
Do we know exactly what it means? Sometimes it's used in different meanings, isn't it? Professor Greim.
No, that's actually the point. The term precautionary principle is misused or is differently used. I had the privilege in one of the SOT meeting to defend or to dispute the precautionary principle from the US side and from the European side. And I tried to convince the Americans how good the precautionary principle is as defined by the European side. And the European defines the precautionary principle as a situation where you do not have sufficient information, but to allow a compound to be used, you are very strict and use very low concentrations until you have better information. That is the definition, the European definition of the precautionary principle. Whereas usually it's used, okay, let's go down or whatever. We generally do not know enough, and then to be on the safe side, we reduce the level by 100-fold or whatever, which is allowed. You know, it is in the European sense, a European terminology, it is a tool to allow the use of a certain compound when there is insufficient information.
Does that make sense to you, Professor? Yeah.
And that sounds reasonably good, Helmut. But if you have a substance where you don't hardly anything about, how low should you go, yeah, for this to fulfill this precautionary principle? I mean, what is the limit value? For example, EPA, they require at least some data when a company comes up and requests to be approved for a certain product to be on the market. They need some data and can also suggest what kind of data they want. But if you don't have anything, how low are you going?
Well, that is not defined. But, you know, if there is a suspicion that the chemical is a reprotoxic chemical and you do not have data, then, and you want to use it, then at least allow it at a certain concentration until you get the proper information about reprotox. That is a basic idea.
Okay. Yes, Professor Kirkland.
I think, drawing again on the analogy from pharmaceuticals, I think you can put restrictions, limitations on the use, on the exposures, just as you would, for example, with an orphan drug or a drug for passionate use. You would put limitations, restrictions, until you had more data in which, or from which, you could then make a more robust evaluation, and you might relax those restrictions. Whether there are situations where you have so little data, you are so uncertain of the risk that you can't even describe the limitations. I don't know. I would imagine no one is going to market with a substance that has that little data on it. But yes, I think it can be a stepwise process.
You know, in the regulatory frame of Europe, then there wouldn't be a authorization if there is so insufficient information.
Yes.
I'm slightly worried that we're kind of moving away from a material like titanium dioxide, which is, by my judgment, rather data-rich, to materials where we know nothing. So we shouldn't, I'm not sure it's helpful to start discussing those. I'm really concerned, I suppose, and for other things, where we have fairly data-rich materials. We have good human data, good animal data, as far as we have it's good quality animal data. Whether it's a question of interpretation. It's not a question of finding information. And we can do a lot more studies on titanium dioxide till the cows come home, I think is the expression. But I'm not quite sure we're going to get a better evaluation. And I would really value what people think about, again, this question about, when is enough information, and how do you make sensible decisions based upon the regulatory frameworks we've got. I don't think we're going to change the regulations. People were arguing for that yesterday and maybe earlier today. And the regulations are there, and they've been quite well deliberated, and they're not stupid. I mean, people have spent a lot of time developing these kind of frameworks to try and fit science into the boxes, which is silly anyway, but they've tried to do that, to give guidelines for classification and setting limits. And I'm rather interested in what people think about the information in front of us with the data-rich material, where we've debated where the strength lies. And going back to what Professor Grimes said yesterday, nobody disagreed that we should be using the weight of evidence in front of us, all the evidence, and that means really the human epidemiological evidence, the animal evidence from in vivo studies and extensive lifetime studies, plus this huge amount of in vitro information we've got. And I think if we can't do it for this, what chance have we got elsewhere?
Yeah. When's enough information? Enough information. And Burslav, on this point?
It's more on the precautionary principle. The precautionary principle in the specific case of titanium dioxide led to the proposal as an inhalation carcinogen. Looking at the justification for the existence of the CLP regulation, which reads in the recitals, to implement a high level of protection for human health. Now, looking at titanium dioxide, would you consider the classification of titanium dioxide justified? Does it lead to a higher level of protection for the general public? Is this classification proposal leading to a higher level of protection, or would the alternative have been other measures looking at the precautionary principles, such as OELs, for example?
I think in English that's called putting you on the spot, right?
Good first.
No, I'm not sure that I can answer. But isn't the protection given not so much by the labeling, but by the eventual limit value that you put? So it doesn't really matter with respect to protection how you label it. It's of course important how you label it eventually, but the main thing is the limit value itself.
Okay. On the same point, an intervention on this side. Well worth running around and making sure all voices get heard.
I'm going to follow on from Len, because I think, Len, you're quite right. We're kind of moving off the issue here. And I just want to bring up some points that I was involved in setting the guidelines right very early on, the new guidelines. I was an expert on the old committee and what have you. And there are a number of points in the classification guidelines that allow us to actually play on the fact that we think this is a mechanism which is not relevant for humans. I'm not going to go into it now, and people know we've put it in comments into the CHL consultation. But we can actually, if we can show the mechanism is not relevant for humans, that is actually a valid way of looking at the classification. The words are in the guidelines to allow us to do it. And the guidelines were written at that point in time, however many years ago it was now, which I can't remember, were written specifically to allow situations where, if something came along which was not relevant for humans, we could get the data and use that data and actually try and not classify something. The whole idea of the classification was to identify things that are high risk, high hazard, that are hazardous. If we got the information that says this wouldn't occur into humans, it's not a mechanism, special case then, I see no reason, well, that's right. I would like to think that we would be pragmatic enough to do it. And even back in 2000, I'm trying to find the paper now, back in 2006, there was ESITOC with Doug McGregor and Alan Bubis and myself and a few others. We actually wrote a process for evaluating modes of action and classifying, essentially to avoid the very situation we're in now, which is taking one study, and to be fair to Lee et al., they said the humours in that study were probably not relevant to humans. So I think we mustn't lose that. But to over-evaluate that and move into a situation where we could be taking something out of the market and not increasing the safety, I think the key thing here is we're not making it safer. I don't disagree with lowering nuisance dust levels and things like that. That's a different argument. But are we really making it safer by classifying as carcinogen? One or two? So that's really my point.
Everybody in full agreement there? Absolutely. So this could be sort of the final word at this symposium then, except for 5 or 6, 7 more interventions coming up. Yes?
Yeah, well, I have a question for the panel. The issue, hopefully something practical, the issue about lung overload has been going on, the discussions have been going on for decades right now, and we've heard, we have our arguments, and we've heard the arguments from we've heard most these arguments have been dismissed kinda by the authorities, and so my question is, how do you think there is a need for more experiments? How do we prove the non-relevance? Is there any studies we can do to prove that the effects seen in the rats are not relevant for humans?
Well, I would say, as Bob McCunney said, this is a very old argument. There are some new data in the last 10 years or so, but essentially the major principles are the same as they were in 1995 and probably even before. We were having, if we could go back to 1995, we've been having a very similar discussion. And that's what's kind of frustrating, is because there aren't really new arguments. It was said back in 95, and maybe Bob wants to comment on this, about the same sorts of things, you know. Maybe we didn't know so much about the particle distribution as much in, well, Nicola's studies were in 2000, so maybe we didn't know exactly that they were so different, or I thought it was really revealing. Meinhold Schultz talked about the really significant difference between human, not only on what exposures, asbestos and cigarette smoke versus PSPs in the rat, but they really are totally different, although they're called similar things, you know, benign and malignant, but they have different derivations. So we know a little bit more, but essentially we're having the same argument we did 20 years ago.
Yeah. Just a moment, Professor, go ahead and then we'll come back to you. Yes? Okay.
Well, that is exactly the point I'm trying to make. We haven't evolved at all, and given the current situation, shouldn't we, as an industry, be thinking of how we might address this issue again with empirical data?
Just a quick comment. I'm not sure that the issue here is lack of relevance. I think it might be more about threshold, because the tumours and the genotoxicity can all be explained in terms of oxidative stress. Okay, in the rat, it handles it in a different way to humans, but probably at the heart of it, it's overload and it's oxidative stress. Does oxidative stress exhibit a threshold? The default position of most regulators is that a potentially genotoxic carcinogen, so a chemical that shows both genotoxic and carcinogenic properties, and you put the two together and you join them up, would not have a threshold. But increasingly, we are finding examples where there will be a threshold. The defense mechanisms, the detoxification processes, just the multiple steps that are involved in getting to the final DNA damaging event, they argue for a threshold. So I don't think, to come to your question, so I don't think this is about, do we need to do more experiments? I think what we need to do is to have more open discussions about, to try to reach agreement on those kind of situations that are likely to exhibit a threshold. How do we define where that threshold is? There's a lot of work going on in the gene tox area, doing dose response modeling, finding points of departure, using those points of departure to set margins of exposure. What are acceptable margins of exposure? How can you define what will be a safe human exposure? I think those are the areas that we need to concentrate on, not doing more experiments with TiO2. I think this is about how to use the data, how to interpret the data, how to position it in terms of safety. I think that's the work that needs to be done.
And then let's move back to the regulation.
No, just a comment to that. There are two scientific committees in the European Commission, SHEA, and the other is an EFSA scientific committee, and both said we assume that there is a threshold for genotoxic carcinogens. The only problem is we have so far not the tool to identify where the threshold, what kind of, is it increased or decreased DNA repair or whatever. Okay, that's one point. But I wanted to say something about the changes of the regulation. I don't think that the regulation should be changed. The only thing is, well, ECHA and the whole thing, I think is perfect. The only problem is that whenever there is a labeling of a compound, immediately the risk of a carcinogenic labeling or classification of a compound which has been labeled, the risk of human exposure should be evaluated right away, and not, and so that the authorization process should be already included in the discussion of classification and labeling. Then it is clear that in the case of titanium dioxide, most likely, as far as I see it, there might be, or there is, exposure at the workplaces, but this is already more or less very nicely taken care of, so that the exposure at the workplace is low, and there is no consumer exposure because the application is usually within some compounds where they are not released. And the consequence there is no consumer exposure, and so that there is no risk. So what is necessary is that whenever there is a labeling, at the same time, there should be a risk assessment. And then I think the situation becomes much clearer than it is at the present time.
Okay, one more intervention on this point. Yes. Linda Axel-Nobel.
Thanks. That was really what I wanted to come back to, and the point I made yesterday is that there's a lot of talk about setting occupational exposures and managing risk. That is one topic, but don't forget the wide use of titanium dioxide in consumer products like paint, which are liquid. This classification would mean we could not use these titanium dioxide. Even at category 2, the damage is done once it's classified as potentially carcinogenic in the mind of the general public. You try buying a British newspaper when this story comes out. The damage is done, and the classification is going to do nothing to protect public health from use of consumer products.
Okay, Professor Levy.
Well, we're caught up in the tyranny of classification, and it's not a thing most scientists like myself like to get involved with. We have no choice. We're caught up in this. But as I said, it would be an interesting academic and scientific debate if it weren't for the fact that when you put a label on something, it triggers a whole, if you like, a constellation of consequences of, if you like, practical importance both for producers and downstream users. And we're caught up in this, whether we like it or not. And I'm not quite sure how we can get out of that. All we can do as scientists is maybe offer the best advice, given the ground rules we got, and see which box it fits. And it goes back into my particular point. We're dealing with here with a very data-rich material in terms of titanium dioxide. And I think we heard from the human evidence. I'll go back to that again. And I'm a great believer in looking at what we've got in front of us. We've heard from May Young about this huge, and don't forget, we don't look at just titania, we look at other people, because if we're talking about a generic particle effect, which we seem to be, then we put into the basket all the particle-related studies in humans, including these extensive studies on coal miners over the last 60 years. They've been studied extensively, plus all the, if you like, the carbon black producers, the titanium producer studies, again, which give us a good picture of what to look at. And the epidemiologists have done their best to tease out all the kind of confounding variables, all the biases that might have misinterpreted. They've explained the very best they can and given us what I think is a very clear picture. IARC agreed with this. I was at the IARC meeting that did titanium, did carbon black, and they came to the conclusion, a different set of epidemiologists to the ones here, that there's no evidence. What's the word they use? Inadequate. Inadequate means, as far as you can see, there's nothing going on. So you've got that. You rest that against the evidence from the rodents. Sorry, when I say the rodents, I mean the rats specifically, which is positive. You look at the genetic data, and I've heard thank you for the arguments today on genetic toxicology, the best, and I understood it the best I could. And for me, there's the picture, and it's not a question of, there's a small risk that can be controlled. I don't feel, from what I've seen and what I've learned over the last 20 years, that the particles, for whatever reason, seem to be causing a problem to humans. And don't forget, in the past, you've got people up to their eyebrows in some of these particles. We're not dealing with the exposures we see nowadays, which are pretty well controlled in most industries that I've seen. And for me, I don't see a hazard. And that's me giving only my opinion as a scientist, using all the evidence in front of me. Other people might come to other conclusions. But, I don't think I'm being illogical on the way I'm using the data in front of me. All I have difficulties is seeing what other people don't see that.
Mm-hmm. Let's also hear from John Fryzak, because you're talking about data, of course, that he explained very well, including showing us some of the people exposed to some of the substances. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, as I said before, I think that the epidemiological data should give people comfort. I mean, you're looking at people throughout different time periods with high levels of exposures and low levels of exposure. You're not seeing any effect whatsoever.
Intervention from the floor? Yes.
No, just, sorry, Sylvia Jacobi again. I was just wondering, having heard all these and having been involved also 20 years ago in some of the studies, I think perhaps the community of the older toxicologists should try to, I'm self coming into that direction, should try to communicate what we know to the younger generation as well. It may be a communication issue. And we have heard how we use existing data in a weight of evidence approach to come to a conclusion at this point in time. So there's a lot of uncertainty that I feel in the modern regulatory community to overlook something what we don't know now. But we have to live with the science as it is now and the weight of evidence we have, and it may change, and then we have to relook at it. And this acceptance is fading away, I have the impression.
I've noticed over the last 40 minutes that the word communication comes up more and more in the whole conversation. And at this time, I think we only have about 12 minutes left for this session. Why don't we use these remaining minutes for a communication exercise? When you think about the 2 days we have spent together here, if you walking out of this room, bumped into one of these TV cameras with a journalist asking you to say it all in 16 seconds and explain the most complex things in too short a period of time. Concentrating on the essentials for those who have not had the privilege of attending this symposium for 2 days, what would be your core message to this? I'm going to start off with you, and we're going to go down the line. Yes, take your microphone, and yes.
I don't think my opinion has changed at all after the 2 days. I think that, in my opinion, the animal studies agree with the human studies. There's no association with any health outcome whatsoever.
Professor Kirkland, your closing message?
I think this is what they used to call, when I worked in industry, the elevator conversation. You have between the ground floor and the first floor to persuade your potential customer. A data-rich compound will inevitably have inconsistent and variable results. Overall, the weight of evidence for titanium dioxide says that there is not a hazard for humans under normal conditions of usage. I don't think my opinion has changed in the last 2 days. How do we communicate that to the outside world? It doesn't sell newspapers, unfortunately.
Professor Levy?
Thank you very much. No, I haven't changed my mind. I've just carried on reinforcing my own prejudices, like most people do. One thing that struck me, and I think it's down to a belief system, that people have looked at the evidence and they form beliefs, and I think that's probably a social construct, just as much as it is a scientific belief in their own minds. And what struck me, and I was at this IARC monograph meeting that did carbon black and titanium dioxide and talc, and we were getting down to this mode of action and concordance between human evidence and animal evidence, and they agreed the evidence was negative for humans, and we got these rat studies and discussions where we're looking at the other effects, looking at the mode of action. You know, this, and as we heard elegantly said by Gunther and Paul Baum yesterday about, inflammation leading to whatever it goes on in rats, and where do humans go in this whole picture. And I think of the maybe 25 people in the working group, there were 2 people thought there was a line between human effects, outcome pathways, and in humans and rats. And there were 2 people out of the group that felt that chain existed for both lines, and therefore one was equivalent to the other. And the argument I heard from one of those people was that, well, the reason that people don't develop cancer when exposed to particles is that you're not exposing them high enough. And if you did, then we'd see the cancers. So that dumbfounded me, because I thought, well, what do you want us to do? Push the exposure limits up just to prove a point? And people have been exposed to horrendous amount of some of these materials in the past. So, and the evidence data we're looking at is not what we see in the plants today. It's what 30, 40, 50 years ago people were exposed to. That's the data we're looking at, where exposures were some of these incredibly high levels. And I thought to myself, well, that's really a belief system. That particular person simply believes, they made a jump in faith that this is going to happen to people if that happens. And I simply don't see it. And I thought, well, we have a belief difference between how you interpret scientific data here. It's not a question of precautionary principle. That's something else. We can debate that endlessly. It's really a question of what you believe and what you see in front of you.
Okay, Professor Oberdoster.
Yeah, I would try to explain the issue of risk. What risk is? Risk is a function of dose and exposure, or excuse me, hazard and exposure. and hazard being the toxicity. And in the case of TI2, we are dealing here with a rather benign material, and to limit the exposure to a low concentration certainly would prevent it. I would try to explain that paradigm also with a figure. And for example, if you are in a zoo and in front of a tiger cage, you see the tiger inside, it's a big risk, a big hazard there, and the tiger is behind a crate, so you cannot be exposed to that. But if the tiger somehow escapes, then you will have a big, big risk because the hazard is there and the exposure is there. In the case of TI2, we are dealing not with a tiger, though, but with a domestic cat. So
Dr. Barhart.
I would say two quick things come to mind. Number one, if I was to meet a person, a man or woman on the street, it might be very difficult to explain species differences. And the other quick note is that the meeting that Len, Gunter, and I were at IARC, Gunter and I were in a certain group, and I remember a woman, somebody from a US regulatory agency saying, well, how do we know if somebody was exposed to 50 milligrams per meter cubed that they wouldn't get lung effects or tumors? And that's one of the reasons why I asked the question, how do you prove a negative? Because one could always say, well, what if it was 50 or 100 milligrams per meter cubed, even though it's not possible? But you can't answer that question. I don't think you can.
Thank you very much.